The morning they found her husband's head on a pike at the gates of Kaifeng, Jade stopped believing in mercy. She was standing on the eastern wall with her second-in-command, watching the Jin army assemble in the valley below, when one of the scouts rode up, his face the color of ash. He did not need to speak. She already knew what he would say. She had heard the screams in the night, had heard the crash of Jin cavalry breaking through the outer defenses, had heard the terrible silence that followed. Jade's real name was Zhang Wei, though no one called her that anymore. 23 years old, the wife of General Chen Wei, and for the past 3 years, a soldier in the Song Dynasty's Northern Defense Force. She had taken up arms the day she realized that her husband's position, his rank, his authority, none of it mattered to the Jin invaders. They wanted only conquest, only the subjugation of the Song people, only the expansion of their Jurchen empire. Now her husband was dead. And her daughter? Where was her daughter? The screams had been everywhere that night. The chaos had been complete. In the darkness and smoke, Jade had pulled on armor and grabbed a sword, had fought her way toward where she thought the medical tent was, but by the time she arrived, there was only blood and ash. The scout dismounted, bowing deeply. General Chen's head, he said quietly. It has been placed at the north gate along with the bodies of 6 other officers. The Jin commander is offering terms. If we surrender the city by sunset, he will spare the remaining soldiers and civilians. If we refuse, he says there will be no mercy. He says he will make the streets run with Song blood until we understand what it means to resist the greater power. Jade did not respond immediately. She was watching the Jin army spread across the valley like a dark stain spreading across silk. There were perhaps 5,000 of them, cavalry, archers, infantry with those terrible axes they wielded with devastating efficiency. The Song garrison defending Kaifeng numbered perhaps 1,500. The city itself had maybe 30,000 civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, the younger men having been conscripted for other battles along the frontier. It was not a siege. It was an execution. What is the commander's name? Jade asked quietly. Wanyan Zong, the scout replied. He is brutal. He is known for his tactics. The other cities that resisted him. The scout's voice trailed off, but he did not need to finish. Jade had heard the stories. Burned cities. Enslaved populations. Entire families erased from the earth as if they had never existed. Summoned the remaining officers to the war room. Jade commanded. And send word to the Jin commander that we will negotiate. Tell him I wish to meet with him personally at midday, alone, in neutral ground between the walls and his camp. The scout looked startled. General, that is extremely dangerous. It would be simple for him to capture you, to use you as leverage. I am aware of the risks, Jade interrupted. Do as I have commanded. She spent the next 3 hours preparing. She bathed the blood of the previous night's battle from her skin. She dressed in formal armor, not the working armor she wore for combat, but the ceremonial armor her husband had worn, the armor of a Song general. She braided her long black hair and fixed it with jade pins. She wanted the Jin commander to see her clearly, to understand that he was negotiating not with a desperate woman, but with a representative of Song honor and pride. At midday, she walked alone through the gates of Kaifeng, toward the Jin lines, carrying a white flag of parley. The Jin commander was waiting for her on a rise between the armies, mounted on a massive black horse. He was a large man, with the features of the Jurchen, high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing, a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He wore armor decorated with gold and crimson silk, the regalia of a powerful man. He smiled when he saw Jade approach. It was not a kind smile. General Zhang Wei, he said, his Song accent slightly corrupted by his native Jurchen. Your husband's courage was notable. His death was swift, which is more than some are granted. I honor his memory by offering his widow and city the chance to surrender with dignity. I have come to propose an alternative, Jade said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her heart. You seek to take Kaifeng. But what use is a city if it is destroyed in the taking? What use are dead civilians if you wish to rule and prosper? I propose a single combat. You choose your champion. I will choose mine. If your champion defeats mine, the city surrenders unconditionally. If my champion defeats yours, you withdraw your forces and allow us to remain in peace. Wanyan Zong stared at her, then he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, full of real amusement. You are either the bravest woman I have ever encountered, or the most foolish. Do you truly believe I would agree to such terms? Do you think I would risk my position on a single combat? I think, Jade said carefully, that you are a man of honor, beneath the ambition. I think you understand that there are ways to win that bring more prosperity and fewer curses than ways that involve the slaughter of the innocent. I think you know that an enemy destroyed utterly is an enemy that can never be useful to you, but an enemy who has been defeated honorably, who has been shown mercy and wisdom. Such an enemy becomes an ally, becomes a trading partner, becomes a source of stability. For a long moment, Wanyan Zong said nothing. He studied her face as if searching for deception. Finally, he said, "If I agree to these terms, and my champion loses, will you be bound by this agreement? Can you compel your forces to surrender?" "I can," Jade said. "I have the authority to speak for the Song garrison. The civilians are under my protection." "Then I agree," Wanyan Zong said. "But not with a champion of your choosing. The combat will be between you and me. Let us see if the widow of Chun Wei has inherited her husband's courage as well as his armor." The news spread through both armies like wildfire. The Song garrison heard that their general's widow had challenged the Jin commander to single combat. Some wept, certain that she was throwing her life away. Others felt a strange spark of hope. If she won, they would be free. If she lost, at least they would have the chance to surrender with honor intact. The Jin army received the news with surprise and a kind of savage excitement. Their commander, who had conquered a dozen cities without losing a man, would face a woman in formal combat. It seemed almost comedic to them, though none dared laugh where Wanyan Zong could hear them. Jade spent the rest of the day in meditation and prayer. She was not a martial artist of exceptional skill. Her strength lay in strategy, in understanding terrain and enemy weakness, in making decisions that kept her soldiers alive. She was competent in combat, but she was not a master swordsman. She would likely die tomorrow, but there was something liberating in that certainty. If she was going to die anyway, then she might as well die on her own terms, fighting for something that mattered. Better to fall with a sword in her hand than to live enslaved, her daughter lost to the chaos of war. As the sun rose the following morning, the armies assembled on the plain between Kaifeng and the Jin encampment. Song soldiers lined the walls of the city, watching. Jin soldiers formed a vast circle, creating a natural arena for the combat. Jade stepped into the circle first, wearing her husband's armor and carrying his sword. The weapon was beautiful, steel that had been folded 100 times, creating patterns like flowing water along the blade. It was a sword that had tasted victory and would, perhaps, taste it one final time. Wanyan Zong entered the circle a moment later, mounted on his black horse. He was even larger up close, with muscles that suggested a lifetime of warfare. He carried a massive curved sword, designed for slashing rather than the precise, controlled strikes that the Song favored. "I give you one chance to withdraw," Wanyan Zong called down to her. "Surrender now, and I will grant you a position in my court. You will be honored, and your people will be spared." "I am already honored," Jade replied, "and my people will be spared not through your mercy, but through my sword." What followed was perhaps the most brutal and beautiful combat ever witnessed on that plain. Wanyan Zong was strong, but Jade was fast. She moved like water, using the terrain, never standing still long enough to be an easy target. His massive sword could crush her armor if it connected directly, but she would not allow it to connect. She circled, struck, withdrew. She drew first blood, a cut along his arm, not deep but enough to show that she was not merely a woman playing at warfare. For 2 hours they fought, and with each passing hour, Wanyan Zong seemed to grow more impressed and less murderous in intent. This was no longer a commander crushing a rebellion. This was a warrior recognizing another warrior, honoring the skill and determination that should never be found in a woman according to the rules of his world. Finally, as the sun approached its zenith and both combatants were bleeding and exhausted, Jade saw her opening. Wanyan Zong overextended on a slash. She pivoted, brought her sword up, and struck him across the shoulder. Not a killing blow, but enough to disarm him, sending his massive sword flying from his hands. For a moment, Jade stood over the Jin commander with her blade at his throat. She could end this. She could kill him and send his army into chaos. The victory would be hers. She lowered her sword. "I could take your life," she said, breathing heavily. But I will not. I am a soldier, not a murderer. You have lost. The city is spared. That is enough. Wanyan Zong looked up at her, blood streaming down his face, and he began to laugh. You are extraordinary, he said. I have never encountered a warrior like you. Very well. I accept my defeat. The siege is lifted. Kaifeng is yours. He stood, accepted the cloth one of his men threw to him, and wiped the blood from his face. As he turned to leave, he paused. Tell me, where did you learn to fight like that? Who trained you? My husband, Jade said. Before the war took him. He trained you well, Wanyan Zong replied. If he were still alive, I would offer him a position in my own army. A man who could teach such skill is valuable beyond measure. The Jin army withdrew, but Wanyan Zong did not leave immediately. Instead, he established an encampment less than a mile from Kaifeng's walls. He sent word that he wished to meet with Jade again, not as enemies, but as fellow warriors who could perhaps learn from each other. It was an unusual request, but Jade was intrigued. She was also cautious. She brought guards with her when she went to Wanyan Zong's encampment late in the afternoon of the day following their combat. The Jin commander received her in his tent, a vast structure hung with silk and heated by a brazier filled with coals. I have been thinking about our combat, Wanyan Zong said, offering her tea. About the way you moved, the precision of your strikes. You fought not like a man trying to prove his strength, but like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Where did that instinct come from? From watching battles, Jade replied carefully, accepting the tea but not drinking from it immediately. I learned that raw strength is often less valuable than understanding. A smaller force that understands the terrain can defeat a larger force that does not. A warrior who understands their opponent's weaknesses can defeat a warrior who is simply stronger. Wisdom, Wanyan Zong said. You should teach my commanders. They are strong, but many of them are simple-minded. They believe that war is solved through brute force. You could show them that there is more to victory than the size of one's sword. I will not teach your army how to more effectively conquer and enslave, Jade said quietly. No, Wanyan Zong agreed. But perhaps you would consider this. The Jin will expand. This is our nature, our destiny. The Song will continue to lose territory and power. This is inevitable. But what if the transition could be managed with less bloodshed? What if Song warriors like you could work with Jin commanders like me to create something new? A blended empire, where the best of both cultures survives. It was a seductive vision, and Jade found herself considering it despite her better judgment. What would such service require of me? For now, nothing, Wanyan Zong said. I am simply planting a seed. I am showing you that there are alternatives to endless warfare and death. Consider what I have said. When you have decided, send word to me. Jade left the tent more confused than when she had entered. She had expected threats or attempted seduction. Instead, she had found something more dangerous, a vision of peace built on compromise, of survival built on accommodation. That night, as she stood on the wall of Kaifeng watching the Jin encampment, she noticed something unusual. There was a disturbance near the edge of the camp, shouting, the sound of horses. She watched as torches moved frantically in the darkness, as if searching for something. In the morning, she received an unexpected visitor. It was a Jin soldier, riding alone under a flag of truce. He carried a message from Wanyan Zong. A creature had escaped from the commander's personal menagerie during the night. It was a wolf, a beast trained for war, used to scout enemy positions and to track fugitives. It was extremely dangerous, and it was loose somewhere in the valley between the two armies. We are searching for it, the messenger explained, but it is clever and fast. If it enters your city, it will bring death to many. I am warning you not for courtesy, but because I honor my agreement with General Zhang Wei. The creature is my responsibility, and I will recapture it. But you should know the danger. Jade thanked the messenger and ordered her sentries to watch for the wolf. She doubled the guards around the city's perimeter. She stationed men at every gate. She did not expect that by nightfall, she would be looking into the eyes of the beast and that it would change everything. The wolf appeared first as a shadow in the gardens on the eastern side of the city, the area furthest from the main garrison. It was enormous, nearly as tall as a man standing on four legs, with gray and black fur matted with blood. It moved with a limp, favoring its left front leg, and there were deep scars across its face and shoulders. Jade was conducting an inspection of the eastern defenses when one of her scouts came running to her, his face pale. "There is a beast in the gardens," he gasped. "It attacked 2 of our men. One is dead. The other is badly injured." Jade followed the scout to the gardens, where a crowd of soldiers had gathered, keeping their distance from a corner where the wolf had cornered itself against a stone wall. The animal was growling, its teeth bared, its amber eyes reflecting the torchlight with an intensity that suggested intelligence and desperation rather than mere animal rage. "Kill it," one of the officers commanded. "Use arrows. Keep your distance." "Wait," Jade said, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. Something about the wolf spoke to her. The limp, the scars, the way it kept its back against the wall, protecting itself from multiple angles. This was not a wild beast acting on animal instinct. This was a prisoner, just as she had been a prisoner of war. This was a being that had been broken by captivity and training. "General," the officer protested, "it is dangerous. It has already killed one of our men." "I am aware," Jade interrupted. "Lower your weapons. Leave this to me." The officers exchanged uncertain glances but obeyed. Slowly, the soldiers retreated, creating a space between Jade and the wolf. When they had given her room, Jade did something that seemed to many observers to be absolutely insane. She dropped her sword. She removed her helmet. She sat down cross-legged on the ground, a distance from the wolf, making herself deliberately small and vulnerable. "I know what you are," she said quietly to the wolf, speaking in the soft voice she had once used to calm her daughter during thunderstorms. "I know you have been trained to kill. I know you have been used as a weapon. But tonight, you are just a creature who is hurt and afraid and lost." The wolf's growl intensified, but it did not attack. It watched her with those intense amber eyes, as if trying to understand her intention. "My name is Jade," she continued, "and I was also broken by war. I was also made into something other than what I was born to be. My husband taught me to fight. The gene taught me to lose. And I am still learning how to be myself again, how to be something more than just a weapon." She waited. The night was cold, and her breath misted in the air. The wolf's breath also misted, and she could see the animal was exhausted, at the edge of its strength. "I cannot give you your freedom," Jade said, "but I can give you something else. I can give you a choice. You can attack me, and my soldiers will kill you, and your suffering will end. Or you can come with me, and I will try to teach you that there are other ways to live, that there is compassion in this world, that even broken things can be healed." For a long moment, the wolf did not move. Then, very slowly, it limped forward. It approached Jade, its teeth still visible, but its posture slightly less aggressive. It sniffed her, investigating her scent. And then, in a gesture that astonished all the watching soldiers, the wolf lay down beside her. It did not curl against her protectively, but it lay close enough to acknowledge her presence, close enough to suggest that some kind of communication had been established. "Bring me blankets and water," Jade commanded, "and someone fetch the healer. This beast needs attention." The wolf remained with Jade through that night and into the next day. She called it Shen, a name that meant divine spirit in the old language. Slowly, over the course of 3 days, the animal began to trust her, though it remained wary of the other soldiers and would not allow anyone but Jade to approach it. On the 4th day, Jade received another message from Wanyan Zong. The Gene commander wished to meet with her again, this time in the city itself. He was willing to come to her, a gesture of respect and a recognition that their previous combat had created a bond of warrior honor between them. They met in Jade's private quarters, with only a single servant present. Wanyan Zong was surprised to find the wolf resting near Jade's chair, its scarred head resting on the ground, its amber eyes following the Gene commander's movements. "You have tamed him," Wanyan Zong said with obvious respect. "I have tried for 3 years. I could not break his will. He was too strong, too intelligent. But you have accomplished what I could not." "I have not tamed him," Jade said quietly. "I have recognized him. There is a difference. This animal, like all beings, simply needs to know that he is valued for something other than his capacity to destroy. He needs to know that his life has meaning beyond warfare." "You speak as if you were describing a man, not a beast," Wanyan Zong observed. "Perhaps," Jade said, "or perhaps the distinction between man and beast is less clear than we have been taught. All of us, human and animal, respond to the same things: safety, food, companionship, purpose. It is only the scale that changes. Wanyan Zong was silent for a long moment. I have come to make a proposal, he said finally. The Jin court is growing restless. They question why I have not fully conquered Kaifeng, why I am negotiating with the Song instead of crushing them. I am being recalled to the capital to explain myself. But before I go, I wish to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. I will give you honesty, Jade said. Do you truly believe that the Song and Jin can coexist? That we can find a way forward that does not require endless warfare? Jade considered the question carefully. I believe, she said, that change is coming whether we will it or not. The Jin are stronger, more unified, more willing to use tactics of terror. The Song are fracturing, divided among themselves. Ultimately, Jin rule will spread across these lands. But the question is not whether Jin will rule, but how. Will they rule through blood and ash, leaving behind only hatred and desire for revenge? Or will they rule through wisdom, incorporating the best of Song culture and traditions, creating something that can actually prosper and grow? And you believe I am capable of such wisdom? Wanyan Zong asked. I believe you have glimpsed it, Jade replied. I believe that underneath your ambition and your training as a warrior, there is a man who understands that conquest is different from building, that the two require different skills. Wanyan Zong stood and walked to the window, looking out at his encampment. I am returning to the capital, he said. I will tell the Jin court that Kaifeng has agreed to acknowledge Jin's sovereignty in exchange for relative autonomy in local governance. It is not true, but it is what they will accept. It will buy time for us all to think about what comes next. He turned back to face her. I am leaving Shen with you. He is too great a creature to be broken further by captivity and war. Perhaps what you have begun can continue. Perhaps he can learn that there are other ways to live. And when the Jin court demands your explanation of why you have not conquered this city completely, Jade asked, I will tell them that some battles are won not through destroying your enemy, but through becoming something more than an enemy, Wanyan Zong replied. And if they do not understand, then so be it. I have spent my life being what others demanded of me. Perhaps it is time to be something else. After Wanyan Zong departed with his army, Kaifeng was left to rebuild. The city was damaged, but not destroyed. The civilian population was devastated by loss, but not annihilated. And Jade, for the first time in years, found herself in a position not of constant warfare, but of actual leadership. The wolf, as Shen became known throughout the city, became an unexpected symbol of that new era. Jade began taking the animal with her as she moved through the city, overseeing repairs and restoration. The wolf's presence seemed to calm people. Here was a creature that had been trained as a weapon but was now living peacefully, walking alongside its former enemy, without aggression or fear. Children who had known only war began to play again when they saw the wolf moving without threat through the streets. Merchants who had hidden their goods began to reopen their shops. The city began to breathe again. Jade also began to make changes to how the garrison was organized and trained. She implemented the strategic thinking she had shared with Wanyan Zong, teaching her commanders to think in terms of long-term stability rather than short-term conquest. She established trade relationships with nearby Jin settlements, understanding that economic interdependence was more sustainable than military dominance. It was not easy. There were those in the Song court who saw her negotiations as betrayal. There were military commanders who believed that she should prepare for renewed warfare rather than investing in reconstruction. But Jade was firm in her vision, and because she had proven herself in combat, no one could question her authority. 2 years after the siege, Jade received a letter from Wanyan Zong. The Jin commander had survived his appearance before the court, but only barely. He had been stripped of his position and was living in semi-exile on the frontier. But he wrote that he was at peace, that he had begun to understand what Jade had been trying to teach him, and that he was working quietly to build alliances that might one day lead to genuine cooperation between Jin and Song territories. The wolf taught me more than military training ever did, he wrote. By showing me that even a broken creature can choose gentleness, Shen showed me that even a broken man can choose a different path. I have spent my life creating weapons. Now I am trying to learn how to create peace. I owe you a debt that I can never repay, except to spend the rest of my life trying to honor what we began. Jade kept this letter private, but it gave her strength in the difficult days that followed. She was building something unprecedented, a Song city that acknowledged Jin's sovereignty while maintaining its own culture and independence, a place where people could live with a reasonable expectation of safety, a garrison that prepared for defense but was not constantly oriented toward conquest. The wolf became old. His limp, which had never fully healed, became more pronounced. His fur turned gray and white. But he remained with Jade, and she remained devoted to him, understanding that this animal had given her a gift as precious as anything she had received. He had shown her that redemption was possible, that broken things could be restored, that even the instruments of war could become instruments of peace. When Shen died, at what Jade estimated to be approximately 20 years old, an extraordinary age for a wolf, the entire city mourned. Jade held a funeral for the animal with all the dignity that would be afforded to a fallen soldier. The priesthood blessed his body. The people lined the streets as she led a procession to the burial site, a sacred place overlooking the valley where the great siege had taken place. She buried Shen with a ceremony, along with gifts from the people of Kaifeng, scrolls on which they had written their memories of how the wolf had changed their lives, carvings and sculptures, offerings of rice and tea. It was not a traditional burial for a beast, but nothing about Shen had been traditional. On the burial stone, she had inscribed words in both Song and Jin. Here lies Shen, who taught us that enemies can become friends, that weapons can become bridges, that even the most broken among us can choose to be whole. In the years following Shen's death, Jade continued to lead Kaifeng through times of political transition. The Jin Dynasty did eventually absorb the Song Empire, as she and Wanyan Zong had understood would happen. But because of the groundwork they had laid, the transition was less violent than it might have been. Song culture was integrated into Jin society rather than being systematically destroyed. Jade herself was offered a position in the Jin imperial administration, an honor she accepted, using her influence to advocate for policies that honored both cultures. She never forgot the wolf. She never forgot the lesson that Shen had taught her, that in a world that seemed determined to divide people and animals into categories of enemy and ally, winner and loser, there was always the possibility of choosing something else. Choosing recognition of the humanity and dignity in another being. Choosing to build bridges instead of walls. Choosing to see wounds as opportunities for healing rather than as reasons for continued warfare. Jade lived to old age, and when young warriors came to learn strategy and leadership, she would tell them about the wolf. She would describe how Shen had limped through the city, how the animal had chosen peace despite having been trained for war, how the sight of that wounded creature living without aggression had transformed an entire population's understanding of what was possible. A wolf is not so different from a soldier, she would tell them. Both are capable of violence. Both have been trained for destruction. But both are also capable of transcending those limitations. Both can choose, in the end, who and what they will be. Never underestimate the power of that choice. When Jade died, more than 50 years after the siege of Kaifeng, the Jin court recognized her as one of the great architects of peace in an era of war. She was buried in state, with honors befitting one of the most influential generals and statespeople of her time. But the memorial that mattered most to her, the one that lasted longest, was the small shrine built at the site of Shen's burial, where pilgrims came for centuries after to remember the wolf who had taught the world that redemption was real. The years after the siege taught Jade something that no amount of martial training could have taught her, that the true power of a leader lay not in their ability to wage war, but in their ability to imagine and build peace. She had been trained from childhood to see the world in terms of conflict, to understand relationships as hierarchies of power and submission. But Shen had changed that understanding. Every day for 2 decades, she had cared for an animal that could have killed her. Every day, she had chosen gentleness over caution. Every day, the wolf had chosen to trust her despite having every reason to mistrust humans. This daily practice of mutual trust and care had fundamentally altered Jade's perception of what was possible in human relationships and governance. She began to implement what she called the principle of the wolf in all her decisions. Before taking any action, she asked herself, is this creating more division or more connection? Is this building walls or bridges? Is this preparing for war or for peace? This principle sometimes put her at odds with more traditional military thinkers. There were moments when refusing to engage in preemptive strikes against Jin settlements, when choosing dialogue over military confrontation seemed foolish and dangerous. But her instincts, honed by her time with Shen, proved sound more often than not. One particular incident stood out. Approximately 5 years after the siege, a Jin general named Wanyan Zong launched an unprovoked attack on a Song merchant caravan traveling between Kaifeng and another city. Dozens were killed. The Song court demanded that Jade authorize retaliation. They expected her to gather her forces and strike back, to teach the Jin that such aggression against Song interests would not be tolerated. But instead, Jade did something unexpected. She sent an emissary directly to Wanyan Zong's superior, not to demand justice, but to ask for a meeting to understand what had motivated the attack. She invited Wanyan Zong himself to come to Kaifeng as her guest, with complete safety guaranteed. Most of her officers thought she had lost her mind. Inviting the man who had murdered their citizens to come to the city as a guest? It seemed like betrayal, like weakness, like a failure of her duty to protect her people. But Wanyan Zong came, and when he arrived, Jade brought him to see the shrine where Shen was buried. She told him the story of the wolf, of how a creature trained for war had learned to live for peace. And then she asked him a simple question. Why did you attack the caravan? Wanyan Zong was quiet for a long time. Because I did not understand why, he finally said. I had heard about you, about how you defeated the great Wanyan Zong in single combat. I had heard about your negotiations, your willingness to acknowledge Jin's sovereignty. I thought perhaps you were weak, that you had been defeated and had given up your will to fight. So I tested you, to see if you would respond with strength or with further capitulation. And what do you see now? Jade asked. I see, Wanyan Zong said slowly, looking at the shrine and the grave beyond. Something more complex than either strength or weakness. I see someone who has the strength to fight, but who has chosen to transcend fighting. I see someone who is not defeated, but transformed. I see wisdom. Jade did not demand retaliation for the attack. Instead, she established a system of compensation for the families of those who had died. She invited Wanyan Zong to stay in the city for a month, to observe how Kaifeng functioned, how Song and Jin communities were beginning to coexist. When he left, he took with him a changed perspective and, more importantly, he took the message that the future did not have to be written in blood. By the time Jade was in her 50s, she had become something unique in the history of warfare and governance. She was neither purely Song nor purely Jin, but something new, a woman who had understood that categories and divisions were ultimately less powerful than the shared recognition of common humanity. She had spent decades proving that this was not a naive philosophy, but a practical approach to building stable societies that could prosper. But she was also aware that her influence was limited by the nature of power structures. She could guide policy in Kaifeng and could advise the Jin administration, but she could not change the fundamental nature of a state built on conquest and hierarchy. She could build pockets of peace, but she could not transform the entire empire. This knowledge weighed on her. In her private hours, when she would visit Shen's shrine and sit in meditation, she would contemplate what remained undone. The world was still full of violence, still organized around warfare and domination. Her work had prevented some suffering, had opened some minds, but it had not transformed the fundamental nature of human conflict. One evening, a young priestess from the local temple came to her with a proposal. The priestess, whose name was May, was perhaps 25 years old. She had grown up after the siege and had never known a world in which Song and Jin were in active warfare. To her, Jade's vision of peace was not radical but natural, not idealistic but practical. There are many of us, May explained to Jade, who wish to spread what you have learned beyond Kaifeng. We wish to establish sanctuaries, places where wounded soldiers, traumatized animals, broken people can come to heal. We wish to tell the story of Shen and you across all the territories, to show people that redemption is real and possible. We wish to create something that will outlive you. General, that will continue the work even after you are no longer here to guide it. Jade was deeply moved by this proposal. She had been so focused on solving immediate crises, on managing governance and politics, that she had not fully considered the possibility of creating institutional structures that could perpetuate her vision beyond her lifetime. Tell me what you envision, Jade said to May. Over the next several months, with May's energy and idealism combined with Jade's practical wisdom and authority, they began to build something revolutionary, a network of sanctuaries across Song and Jin territories. These were places where wounded soldiers could come for healing, both physical and spiritual. Places where traumatized animals could find refuge and rehabilitation. Places where the story of transformation and redemption could be told and retold, teaching new generations that there were alternatives to endless conflict. The priesthood supported this work, understanding that it aligned with their spiritual teachings about compassion and transformation. The Jin administration, remembering Jade's value as an administrator and peacemaker, also provided resources and protection for these sanctuaries. By the time Jade was in her 60s, the network of sanctuaries had spread across most of the former Song territories and into Jin lands as well. There were perhaps 20 sanctuaries in total, each one operating according to principles that Jade and May had established, that healing was possible, that no one was beyond redemption, that animals and humans deserved equal consideration in ethical decisions, that stories of transformation were more powerful than any amount of military force. These sanctuaries operated differently depending on their location and circumstances. Some were primarily devoted to healing wounded soldiers and teaching them alternative ways of living beyond warfare. Others focused on rescuing and rehabilitating animals that had been used in warfare, not just wolves, but horses, dogs, even birds trained for reconnaissance. The sanctuary in Kaifeng itself, which was built around Shen's grave, became the most famous. It attracted pilgrims from across the known world, soldiers seeking redemption, spiritual seekers looking for wisdom, people who had been broken by violence and were searching for healing. Among the visitors was Wanyan Zong himself, now ancient. Having survived political exile and returned to some influence in his later years, he made a pilgrimage to Kaifeng to see what Jade and May had built. When he stood before Shen's grave, he wept, tears of an old warrior who had spent his life mastering the art of destruction, now confronting the possibility that his life might have had a different purpose. "You have built something extraordinary," he said to Jade, who walked with him through the sanctuary despite her advanced age. "You have taken everything we both understood about warfare and transformed it into something that could save lives instead of taking them. I helped create instruments of destruction. You have created instruments of healing. I believe your legacy will outlast mine." "Our legacy," Jade corrected gently. "You made this possible by being willing to reconsider your own path, by choosing to think differently about what victory meant. Without your willingness to be transformed, none of this would have happened." In the final years of Jade's life, she worked with May to document the principles and teachings that had guided the sanctuary movement. They created scrolls that detailed the philosophy of redemption and healing, that told stories of specific individuals and animals who had been transformed, that offered practical guidance for others who wished to establish sanctuaries in their own communities. These scrolls became widely distributed, and the sanctuary movement continued to grow even after Jade's death. By the time of the fall of the Song Dynasty, centuries later, the network of sanctuaries had become one of the most respected and influential institutions across the territories. They survived political upheaval, military conquest, and cultural change because they fulfilled a deep human need. The need to believe that redemption was possible, that transformation was real, that even the most broken among us could be healed. In her final years, Jade was sometimes asked what she considered to be her greatest achievement. Most people expected her to point to specific battles she had won, or to policies she had implemented that had protected Kaifeng from invasion, or to the sanctuary network that had spread her philosophy across continents. But Jade's answer was always the same. "My greatest achievement was learning to see the wolf not as an enemy or a tool, but as a teacher. My greatest achievement was recognizing that the most important battles are not fought with swords, but with compassion. My greatest achievement was understanding that the truest form of strength is the willingness to be transformed." This perspective came not from naive idealism, but from hard experience. Jade had known genuine warfare. She had ordered soldiers into battle knowing that many would not return. She had made strategic decisions that required sacrificing some to save others. She had lived a life marked by the necessities of conflict. But she had also discovered, through her relationship with Shen, that human beings and animals possessed capacities for transcendence that went far beyond what warfare permitted them to express. She had learned that the most powerful forces in the world were not military force but trust, not fear but compassion, not domination but recognition of the dignity in all beings. These lessons were not unique to Jade. Spiritual teachers and philosophers across human history had taught similar truths. But what made Jade's life remarkable was that she had implemented these truths at the level of governance and statecraft. She had not merely preached about the possibility of peace. She had built institutions that embodied peacemaking principles. She had not merely theorized about redemption. She had structured entire systems around the belief that redemption was possible for anyone, human or animal, who was willing to receive it. After Jade's death at the age of 83, the sanctuary movement faced a critical test. Would it survive without her guiding presence? Would the institutions she had founded continue to maintain their principles, or would they gradually revert to more conventional understandings of warfare and animal use? The answer came in the form of May, who by now was in her 60s and had been given formal leadership of the sanctuary network. May had lived her entire adult life under Jade's tutelage and had internalized her principles completely. But unlike Jade, who had always maintained something of the warrior in herself, who understood the language of power and could navigate the complex politics of empires, May was a pure spiritual leader. She brought a dimension to the sanctuary movement that Jade, for all her wisdom, had always lacked. A deep spiritual framework that connected the work of healing and redemption to the deepest teachings of the Buddhist and Taoist traditions that flourished in the territories. Under May's leadership, the sanctuaries became not just places of practical healing, but centers of spiritual practice and teaching. Monks and priests came to study at the sanctuaries, learning not just the history of Jade and Shen, but the spiritual principles that underwrote their relationship. They learned that compassion was not a weakness but a form of strength, that the willingness to be transformed was the highest form of courage, that recognizing the inherent dignity of all beings, human and animal, was a prerequisite for genuine wisdom. The sanctuary movement continued to grow and evolve. By the time of the collapse of centralized imperial authority and the rise of new regional powers, the network of sanctuaries had become one of the most stable and respected institutions across all the territories. They had become places where even bitter enemies could find common ground, where soldiers from opposing factions could come to heal their wounds, where the story of Jade and Shen could remind people that there were alternatives to endless conflict. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jade's legacy was the way her story spread. Through merchants and travelers, through priests and pilgrims, through poets and musicians, the tale of the warrior woman and the wolf became known across vast distances. It was retold, adapted, reimagined for different audiences and cultures. But the core message remained consistent: that transformation is possible, that redemption is real, that even weapons can be transformed into instruments of peace. The story began to transform the way that people thought about themselves and their own possibilities. Young people who felt trapped in cycles of violence began to imagine other paths. Warriors who had spent their lives in service to conquest began to question whether that was truly what they wanted their lives to mean. Rulers who had always assumed that power was maintained through fear began to consider whether it might be maintained more effectively and more peacefully through justice and compassion. This transformation was not instantaneous or universal. There continued to be conflict, warfare, and violence across all the territories. But there was also, gradually and incrementally, a shift in how people thought about conflict and its resolution. There was a growing understanding that victories achieved through destruction were hollow compared to victories achieved through transformation. There was an increasing acceptance of the possibility that even bitter enemies might find common ground. In many ways, Jade's story became more powerful after her death than it had been during her lifetime. When she was alive, she was a specific person with specific limitations and contexts. After her death, her story became universal, applicable to anyone who felt trapped by violence and conflict and was searching for an alternative path. Centuries after Jade's death, scholars debated whether her story was historical fact or spiritual legend. Some pointed to contemporary records that corroborated key elements of the narrative, records of a siege of Kaifeng in 1126, records of a female warrior of remarkable skill, records of the sanctuary movement that had spread across the territories. Others argued that the details had been so embellished by storytellers that the original truth was now obscured beyond recovery. They suggested that perhaps there had been a warrior woman and a wolf, but that the romantic and spiritual elements of the story had been added over time to create a more perfect narrative of redemption and transformation. But most people came to understand that whether the story was literally, historically true mattered far less than the truth it contained. Whether Jade had been a specific historical person or a composite of many people and experiences, whether Shen had been a specific wolf or a symbolic representation of the capacity for redemption that existed in all beings, the important truth was that the story worked. The story changed how people thought about themselves and about what was possible. The story created institutions that continued to heal people and animals centuries after the original events. And that, perhaps, is the highest form of truth, not the accuracy of historical detail, but the power of a narrative to transform reality, to create new possibilities, to allow people to imagine themselves differently, and to build systems that reflected those new imaginations. By the modern era, more than 8 centuries after Jade's original sanctuary was established, the network had evolved significantly. The sanctuaries were no longer primarily focused on the aftermath of warfare, because the nature of warfare had changed radically. But the principles that had guided them remained constant. The belief that redemption was possible, that transformation was real, that compassion and justice were more powerful than fear and domination. The sanctuaries had adapted to address new forms of suffering and trauma. Some focused on rehabilitating animals that had been abused in contexts of exploitation and entertainment rather than warfare. Some worked with human victims of trauma and violence, offering healing practices rooted in the traditions that Jade and May had established. All of them maintained the central principle that every being, no matter how broken or damaged, deserved the opportunity to heal and to be valued for something other than their capacity to produce pain or profit. The story of Jade and Shen remained at the heart of all this work. New generations of sanctuary workers would learn the story and understand that they were part of a lineage stretching back centuries, a lineage of people dedicated to the principle that another way was possible. In the 21st century, the original sanctuary in Kaifeng had become both a museum preserving the history of Jade and Shen and an active healing center continuing the work that Jade had pioneered. Visitors from around the world came to visit Shen's grave, to walk through the gardens where the wolf had first limped into the city seeking refuge, to sit in meditation in the halls where monks had studied the teachings of redemption and transformation for over 800 years. Among the visitors was a young woman named Li Wei, who worked as a veterinarian specializing in trauma-affected animals. She had come to the sanctuary seeking inspiration for her own work, which focused on rescuing and rehabilitating animals that had been used in illegal wildlife trafficking and exploitation. As she stood before Shen's grave, reading the inscription for perhaps the 10th time, something shifted in her understanding. She realized that the work she was doing, rescuing individual animals, helping them heal, giving them a chance at a better life, was part of the same lineage that Jade had started. She was participating in the same transformation that the warrior woman had pioneered, the transformation of beings from instruments of profit or pain into beings valued for their own inherent dignity. Li Wei began to share the story of Jade and Shen with the people she worked with, other veterinarians, animal rights activists, sanctuary volunteers. She began to teach that the rescue and rehabilitation of animals was not just about the individual animals, but about something much larger, about the possibility of transforming human civilization itself, about the possibility of building a world where compassion and justice were the organizing principles of society rather than profit and domination. The sanctuary network that she helped establish in her own country became a continuation of the work that Jade had begun 8 centuries earlier, and it inspired others around the world to begin similar work in their own communities. By the early decades of the 21st century, Jade's story had become one of the most widely known narratives about the possibility of transformation across human civilization. It had been retold in books, films, songs, and spiritual teachings. It had inspired entire movements dedicated to reimagining how humans related to animals, how warfare could be transcended, how broken beings could be healed. Universities offered courses examining Jade's philosophy of redemption and her practical implementation of those principles through the sanctuary system. Artists created sculptures and paintings depicting the moment when Jade first encountered the wolf in the garden. Musicians composed symphonies attempting to capture the emotional journey of both the warrior and the beast. But perhaps most importantly, Jade's story had inspired countless individuals to begin their own work of healing and transformation. There were former soldiers who, moved by Jade's example, had dedicated themselves to helping other veterans find peace and meaning. There were animal rescuers who directly attributed their work to the inspiration they had drawn from Shen's story. There were spiritual teachers who used the narrative of Jade and the wolf as a central teaching about the possibility of transcending conventional categories and divisions. The sanctuary movement that Jade had pioneered, which had spread across territories and centuries, had evolved into a global network of organizations dedicated to animal welfare, trauma healing, and the development of compassion as a central organizing principle in human society. In the final chapter of her published teachings, Jade had written words that continued to guide sanctuary workers and spiritual practitioners centuries after her death. These words seemed to capture the essence of everything she had learned through her relationship with Shen and her decades of work building alternative systems based on compassion and justice. The wolf that came to my city was broken. He had been used as a weapon, trained to kill, captured, and enslaved by systems of warfare and power. By all conventional measures, he was a dangerous creature that should have been destroyed. But when I looked into his amber eyes, I did not see danger. I saw a being who had been deprived of his natural freedom and dignity, just as I had been deprived of my husband and my daughter. I saw a reflection of my own suffering, and I understood that the only way to heal my own wounds was to help heal his. What followed was not a story of victory or conquest, but a story of mutual transformation. The wolf taught me that compassion is not weakness, but the ultimate strength. He taught me that beings can transcend the roles that have been forced upon them. He taught me that redemption is always possible for those who are willing to receive it. If my life has any meaning, it is this, that I learned to see the sacred in what the world had rejected, to recognize the value in what had been deemed worthless, to understand that the most powerful transformations happen not in the halls of power, but in moments of genuine meeting between wounded beings who choose to trust each other despite everything that says they should not. This is the teaching I leave to all who will listen. Look for the wolf in the garden. Look for the broken being that the world has rejected, and recognize that in seeing that being with compassion and treating them with dignity, you are not diminishing yourself. You are becoming your truest self. You are participating in the great work of redemption and transformation that is always possible, always accessible to those who have the courage to choose it. In the present day, more than 900 years after Jade first sat in a garden in Kaifeng and looked into the eyes of a wounded wolf, the sanctuary movement continues. The institutions have evolved, the methods have changed, the specific challenges have transformed. But the fundamental principle remains constant, that redemption is possible, that beings who have been broken by violence and trauma can be healed, that compassion is the most powerful force available to us for creating genuine and lasting transformation. The sanctuary in Kaifeng still stands. Shen's grave is still tended with care and reverence. Pilgrims still come from around the world to sit in meditation at that sacred site and to feel, in their bones, the truth that a warrior woman and a wolf once taught. That love is stronger than war, that trust is stronger than fear, that redemption is always possible for those who seek it. And all around the world, sanctuary workers continue the work that Jade pioneered. They rescue animals that have been abandoned, abused, or exploited. They provide healing spaces for humans who have been traumatized by violence. They tell the story of Jade and Shen to inspire new generations to believe that another way is possible. If you have read this story to the end, you have been introduced to one of history's greatest visionaries, a woman who understood that the way to end cycles of violence was not through greater violence, but through the courageous act of choosing compassion. You have encountered a being, the wolf Shen, who despite having been trained as a weapon, chose to embody the gentleness and trust that the world had taught him to suppress. But this is not just a story about the past. This is an invitation to participate in the present-day continuation of Jade's work. Right now, in sanctuaries around the world, there are animals like Shen, animals that have been broken by exploitation, abuse, or warfare, that are being given the chance to heal and to discover that there is goodness in the world. There are humans who have been traumatized by violence who are finding their way back to wholeness and meaning through the compassionate guidance of sanctuary workers. And there are people like you, people who have been moved by the story of Jade and the wolf, who are being called to participate in this work. Whether you can donate to support sanctuary work, volunteer your time and skills, share this story with others, or simply hold the vision of a more compassionate world in your heart, your contribution matters. The sanctuary movement that Jade started 9 centuries ago is still alive, still growing, still transforming lives, and creating the possibility of genuine healing in a world that often seems defined by violence and suffering. Please visit and support HeroPaws Rescue, a sanctuary dedicated to rescuing animals that have been abused, abandoned, or exploited, and providing them with the care, healing, and second chance that every being deserves. At HeroPaws Rescue, we believe that in saving these animals, we are participating in the great work of redemption and transformation that Jade and Shen pioneered so many centuries ago. We believe that every rescued animal reminds us of our own capacity for compassion. We believe that every act of healing is an act of resistance against systems of exploitation and violence. We believe in Shen's story. We believe that broken things can be healed. We believe that another way is possible. Subscribe to our channel. Follow our mission. Become part of a global community dedicated to making Jade's vision real in the modern world. Because in the end, we are all like Jade or like Shen. We are all either warriors learning to choose peace, or we are wounded beings learning to trust again. And the sanctuary, whether physical or spiritual, is always available for those who seek it. With deep gratitude and infinite hope, HeroPaws Rescue, where every creature finds its way home, where the vision of Jade and Shen lives on.